There is a way this verse gets said out loud, and there is a way it gets said quietly. Out loud, it sounds like encouragement. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. People say it at baby dedications. They stitch it onto blankets. They read it at the front of a room full of young parents who are still hopeful about everything. Quietly, it sounds like a verdict. It sounds like it at 2 a.m. in the head of somebody whose child is 35 now and hasn't been inside a church since he was 19. Because if the verse is a promise, and the promise didn't happen, then there is only one place left for the blame to land, and that person already knows exactly where they think it landed. So here's the question this whole study is built on. Is this verse a guarantee? Before we go anywhere near an answer, I want to give you something you can check yourself in about 10 seconds, because it changes how you read every sentence that comes after it. Open to Proverbs 26. Look at verse 4. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. Now look at verse 5. The very next line. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Read those again, back to back, in the order they actually sit on the page. Don't answer him. Answer him. 2 verses side by side in the same chapter, telling you opposite things. That is not an editing mistake. Nobody missed it. It sat there through every generation of scribes who copied this book by hand, because it was never a problem to be fixed. It is the book showing you out loud how it expects to be read. Because if these were formulas, if Proverbs worked the way we've been taught to read Proverbs 22:6, then verse 4 and verse 5 would cancel each other out, and the whole chapter would collapse. They don't collapse. They sit there next to each other, both true because a proverb is not a formula. Applying one takes discernment about which situation you are actually standing in. And that discernment is the thing the book keeps asking for. That is the same book, 4 chapters after the verse about the child. Here's why that matters for the person who's been carrying this. If you have read Proverbs 22:6 as a contract, do this, receive that, you didn't invent that reading. It's how the verse gets handed to people, on a blanket, in nice lettering, but it's a way of reading that the book itself doesn't support 4 chapters later. And we're going to spend the rest of this study watching Proverbs tell you that over and over in its own words. I want to be clear about something up front, because it shapes everything after. Nothing in this study is going to tell you the verse is false. It isn't. The plain reading of Proverbs 22:6 was never wrong. It was incomplete. And the missing piece is the one that takes the weight off. Let's keep going through the book itself. Proverbs 10:4. He becometh poor that dealeth with a slack hand, but the hand of the diligent maketh rich. Now, what's this? Does anybody read that as a guarantee? Has anyone ever stood in front of a hardworking family who lost everything anyway and told them the verse proves they weren't diligent? Nobody does that. We understand instinctively what that proverb is doing. It's telling you how life generally runs. Work hard, and you tend toward provision. Everybody reading it knows there are diligent people who got sick, diligent people who got laid off at 58, diligent people whose business failed in a year nobody could have planned for. The proverb isn't lying to them. It's describing the shape of things, not signing a contract about every individual case. Proverbs 3:9-10 does the same thing. Honor the Lord with thy substance, and thy barns shall be filled with plenty. Most of us immediately recognize the danger in turning that into guaranteed wealth. So here's the thing worth sitting with. We already read the whole book this way. Every proverb about money, about speech, about diligence, about friendship, we read all of them as wisdom describing how life tends to go. Except one. Proverbs 22:6 is one of the very few verses in this book that people read as a legally binding promise. And the reason isn't textual. The reason is that it's about our children. And the stakes are so high that we needed it to be a guarantee. That's not a failure of anybody's reading. That's what love does when it's frightened. But it means the weight sitting on that verse was put there by us, not by the book. Now, before anyone thinks this is a study about letting children raise themselves, look 9 verses further down the same page. Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. Same chapter, 9 verses later. The writer is not sentimental about children, and he is not naive about what raising one takes. This book is full of that. Proverbs 13:24, Proverbs 29:15. The whole vocabulary of correction and discipline used seriously and repeatedly. So the point of verse 6 was never that formation doesn't matter. The book insists that it does on the same page. The point is what happens when a parent did all of it and the outcome still went sideways. Because a chapter this willing to talk about correction is also a chapter that never once says a departed child is proof the correction was missing. That's a distinction worth holding on to. This book takes parenting seriously enough to command it, and it never turns around and uses the results as evidence against the parent. Now stay with the question, is this verse a guarantee? We're not answering it yet. There's something in the book of Samuel that has to come first. There was a man whose public record was as clean as anyone's in the Old Testament, Samuel. He grew up in the tabernacle. He heard God as a child. He led Israel his whole adult life. And at the end of it, in 1 Samuel 12, he stood in front of the people and asked them directly whether he had ever defrauded anyone, taken anything, oppressed anyone. And the entire nation answered no. And then 1 Samuel 8:3, about his sons. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Read that again with the question we're carrying. The man with that record raised sons who took bribes. Now here's the detail that matters most, and it's about what the text doesn't say. Compare it with Eli a few chapters earlier. Eli's sons are corrupt, and Scripture is completely specific about the father. It tells us exactly what Eli knew and exactly what he failed to do. He restrained them not, and God holds him to it by name. With Samuel, the text records his son's corruption and never makes that accusation. No line about what he knew, no rebuke, no prophet sent. I'm not going to turn that silence into a declaration that Samuel was a flawless father. The text doesn't say that either. And he's the one who appointed those sons as judges in the first place. What I can tell you is that Scripture had the vocabulary to blame a father, used it plainly on Eli, and did not use it here. It is willing to make that accusation when it means to. It didn't make it about Samuel. Two fathers, two sets of sons who went wrong. In Eli's case, Scripture explicitly names the father's failure. In Samuel's, it records the son's corruption without giving that same rebuke. At minimum, the Bible itself refuses to treat every child's failure as automatic proof of a parent's failure. If that distinction has ever been denied to you, if this verse got used to put you in Eli's category without anybody checking whether you belonged there, I want you to notice that the Bible itself was more careful with you than that. There's a line in Ezekiel that goes even further, and it's about as blunt as Scripture gets on this. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. Ezekiel 18:20. That's not a verse about parenting technique. It's a verse about where responsibility sits. And it says in plain language that a grown child's choices belong to the grown child. That also speaks to something a lot of parents have quietly wondered about and rarely say out loud. Two children, same house, same table, same rules, same church every Sunday. And they turn out completely differently. One steady, one gone. If the verse were a formula, That couldn't happen. The same inputs would have to produce the same outputs. It happens constantly. It happens in Scripture. There were never identical inputs producing identical outputs. There were two separate people, each with a will of their own, being formed by the same hands. So we have the book of Proverbs showing us that its sayings take discernment rather than mechanical application. We have Samuel, whose sons went wrong while the text withheld the accusation it had already made against someone else. We have Ezekiel drawing the line between one person's choices and another's. But there's one more biblical picture, and it makes the guarantee reading very hard to sustain. Isaiah 1:2. The very opening of the book, the first thing out of the prophet's mouth. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. Sit with that sentence for a second. That's God. That's the parent with no flaws, no bad days, no lost temper, no inconsistency, no moment of being too tired to do it right. Perfect formation, perfect provision, perfect patience. The language is literally, I nourished and brought them up, and the children rebelled. If perfect parenting guaranteed the outcome, that verse could not exist. It would be a contradiction sitting in the first paragraph of Isaiah. It isn't a contradiction. It's the honest description of what it is to raise someone who has a will of their own. And God says it about Himself, out loud. At the start of a book, look at who He calls as witnesses to, heaven and earth. He isn't saying it privately. The whole created order is summoned to hear a parent say, I raised them, and they went. Read on a few verses, and it gets more specific. The complaint isn't that the children were never taught, it's the opposite. The ox knows his owner, and the donkey his master's crib. But Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. The grief in that passage isn't over a failure of instruction. It's over people who had every reason to know and didn't act like it. That's a very particular kind of ache. And any parent who has watched a grown child do something they were absolutely raised to know better than recognizes it immediately. That's the thing I'd want somebody to hear if they've spent 15 years assuming the departure was proof of their failure. The parent you have been comparing yourself against, the one who did it perfectly, the one you keep coming up short of, that's God. And His children walked away too. And He describes it not as a verdict on His parenting, but as grief over theirs. One thing before we keep going. The reason these studies take as long as they do is the part nobody sees on the other side of the screen. Going back to check a passage before it goes in the script, and sometimes cutting the best line in the whole thing because the text doesn't actually say it. That's the work. If you want more of it, subscribing is what makes more of it possible. So let's come back to the verse itself, because we still haven't answered what it is, only what it isn't. Is this verse a guarantee? No. And now I can tell you what it is instead, which is better than what people have been carrying. Proverbs 22:6 is a statement about the durability of early formation. What you put into a child early goes deep and lasts long. That is what the verse claims, and it is claiming it with confidence. The writer isn't hedging. He's saying, this matters. It holds. It stays with a person all the way into old age. And notice how far out he sets the marker. Not when he is grown, not by the time he's 20, when he is old. The writer is describing something that persists across a whole lifetime, decades after the parenting is over, long after the parent has any control left, still working. The verse says early formation reaches all the way into old age. It does not say a child who leaves is guaranteed to come back. That hope is a reasonable one to hold, and many parents hold it. It just isn't what this sentence is promising, and it doesn't need to be for the weight to come off. What the verse does say is that early formation has enduring power. What goes in early can shape a life for decades. And that's worth thinking about concretely. because formation lasts sounds abstract until you've seen it. It looks like a 30-year-old who hasn't prayed in a decade in a hospital corridor at 4 in the morning, finding out that words he hasn't said since he was 12 are still all the way in there and come out without being summoned. It looks like an adult who has consciously rejected everything they were raised in and still, without noticing, keeps the ethics of it. Still can't lie comfortably, still can't walk past someone who needs help, still carries a conscience shaped by a house they say they left. It looks like somebody at 50 at a funeral who finds that the only language they have for grief is a language they learned at a kitchen table before they could read. None of those are returns, and I won't call them that, but they are the kind of thing early formation is capable of doing in a life, long after anyone was still watching. Now, there's one piece of this verse I have to handle honestly, because it's the part everyone argues about. And I told you at the start that I'd tell you where the ground is solid and where it isn't. In the way he should go. The Hebrew there says something closer to according to his way. And what that phrase means has been debated for centuries. Some read it as the way of wisdom the child ought to be formed toward. There's an older tradition that reads it as the particular capacity or bent of that individual child. Both readings have serious people behind them, and I'm not going to tell you which one is right because the honest answer is that this is a live question, and anybody who tells you it's settled is telling you more than the text can carry. What I can tell you is that under either reading, the verse is describing intentional formation of a specific young person, and under neither reading does it turn into a contract. Here's where the text ends and my application begins. And I want to name that clearly because they're different things. If there's anything in the according to his way reading, then one reasonable way to live it out is paying attention to the actual child in front of you rather than a generic one. The child who takes the toaster apart to see how the wires run isn't necessarily being defiant. That might be curiosity that needs somewhere to go. The child who goes quiet in a room full of people isn't failing at faith. He may be holding all of it and not performing any of it. Two children in the same house, same rules, same table, can need to be formed toward the same wisdom by noticeably different routes. That is an application. It's a reasonable one, but it's mine, not Solomon's, and you're free to disagree with it without disagreeing with the verse. Which brings us to the part of this I've been walking toward the whole time. Somebody watching raised a child by every rule they knew. Church every week, prayer before meals, the verse on the wall in the hallway, and that child is grown now and wants nothing to do with any of it. And at some point somebody, usually kind, usually well-meaning, often at church, said this verse to them, maybe gently, maybe as a question, and it landed as a diagnosis. If he departed, you must not have trained him up. There is no tidy resolution to hand you for that, and Scripture doesn't offer one. What it does offer is this. By now you have seen, in the text itself, every reason that verse cannot be used the way it was used on you. It can't be used as a verdict, because the book it comes from shows you 4 chapters later that applying its wisdom takes discernment, not mechanical rule following. It can't be used as a verdict because when Scripture wanted to name a father's failure, as with Eli, it did so explicitly. And it does not give Samuel that same rebuke. It can't be used as a verdict because Ezekiel says outright that a grown child's choices are the grown child's. And it can't be used as a verdict because God himself raised children who rebelled and said so in the first sentence of Isaiah, and no one has ever concluded that the problem was the parenting. Anyone reading this verse as proof of your failure has to explain Isaiah 1:2, and they can't. There's another picture of this in Scripture worth naming, And I'll keep it as a picture rather than an argument because that's what it is. The son in Luke 15 was gone for a long time. Not away at school, gone, with the money spent, and no plan for coming back. And the father in that story spends the whole middle of it doing the only thing left to do, which is watching a road. He sees the son when he was yet a great way off, which tells you where the father had been looking. That parable isn't an interpretation of Proverbs 22:6, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But it's another place where Scripture shows a child's story not being finished during the years he was away. 3 words from this study tend to stay with people: formation, verdict, or Isaiah. That first sentence, where God describes his own children walking away. Leave the one that stayed with you in the comments. Whichever comes up most is the one we take further next time. So, one more time, and now with everything behind it. Is this verse a guarantee? No. It's something more honest than a guarantee, and it always was. It's wisdom about how deeply early formation can shape a life, how far it reaches, how long it lasts, how much of a person can still be running on what was put in before they could choose it. What it is not, and never was, is a formula that lets anyone look at a grown child's choices and pronounce a verdict on the parent. And it was never, at any point, a verdict on the parent. The blanket was never wrong. It was just never finished. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Proverbs 22:6. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. Isaiah 1:2. Next time, we're looking at another sentence people have been handed at the worst possible moment. The one that says God won't give you more than you can handle, and where it actually comes from.